Dr. Nordlof, and I'm the director here of the Eastern Writing Center, and I'm happy to be with all of you today. And we're going to go through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus first on commas and then on semicolons and colons. So this is really some basic punctuation issues that I think, and we're going to give you a few principles that you can think about when you're using punctuation. And I think the big thing I'll start off by saying is I think a lot of times we think of these grammar as terms of rules, things that you have to follow and not, and there is some element to that there are guidelines that we're looking at, but I think the other way to look at it is these are really ways to help you to communicate more effectively. So you can think of punctuation, for example, as tools that you can use to be able to make your ideas better expressed. And what it does, what punctuation can do for you is really I would say two things. One is to break up ideas, parts of a sentence, and also to connect ideas, to show relationship between ideas. And so that's really, if I was to think of an overview of what we're doing here today, that's what we would be focused on, okay? But here we're going to look at commas, and the way I'm going to approach this is the way I usually do, is to focus on the idea of, and let me see if I can, there we go. We're going to focus on what I and some others have called the four main ways. And so we're kind of grouping comma usage into four main ways that commas are and can be used. This is not 100% of the ways that commas can be used, but I think what we find is that this grouping of four here really covers most, if not all, of the main ways that you might use a comma. So what are those ways? Well, the first one is when we have a list. We have separate items in a list. We can use commas to separate them. Second one is when we're linking ideas, and this is when we have two independent clauses. And so an independent clause meaning it's really like a separate sentence, or could be a sentence, but when we're linking, we're using commas to be able to combine those into into one sentence. So we're sort of combining things and showing relationship, as we'll see. Then we have introductory elements, and sometimes those can be words, phrases, or clauses that come at the beginning of a sentence and precede what we would consider the main clause. Okay. The last one is kind of the most complicated in a way. We call it inserting, and this is where we consider non-essential elements, almost like asides or additional information. Sometimes we use commas to set those things off. Okay. So sometimes we have a list. When we have more than two items in a list, we can use commas to divide those items. And you can see sometimes you have here a word like, Susie went to the store to buy shampoo, toothpaste, and milk. Sometimes we have a phrase here, to guess the name, the eye color, and the favorite restaurant of the other contestants. Or sometimes you could have complete clauses. That means like they could be treated as a sentence in themselves. Bobby, who is wearing a star stick on a shirt, who had a smile from ear to ear, and who just received his first report card, had a great first year of school. Isn't that nice? So we use a comma to separate those items after the first item, the second item, and then on and on, including, and I would recommend including before that conjunction that you see at the end. And it's usually an and, but it could be an or, I guess, would be the other conjunction that we might see there. Most writers include all of those commas, including the one right before that conjunction. We have a special word for that. We call that an Oxford comma. Sometimes people call it a serial comma. Okay, but I would recommend that. But again, some people, as I was saying, some of the guidelines that we see in grammar, some things people feel pretty confident about, and there's kind of universal and near universal agreement. There's some things where there's some, people say, well, there's some different ways to do it. Okay. So that's the first one. So that's when we have a list. So listing. Okay. Now the second way is where we have a two independent clauses. So you have, in this case, you have two really what could be complete sentences, but you want to combine them and maybe show the relationship between those things. And the key here is that we use a comma, but then after the comma, we use a coordinating conjunction. And you might say, well, what's a coordinating conjunction? These are words that coordinate. Sometimes they coordinate words, phrases, and in this case, we're using them to coordinate clauses. So they're connecting two independent items here, and there's only 7 of them: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. People tend to use this mnemonic or memory device called fanboys to remember those things. Most common of them are really and, but, or, so would be kind of the most likely used, but there are some others. Okay. And you can see here, so he thought he had completed the assignment, comma, and then we use that coordinating conjunction. But there was a backside to the worksheet. Jen was feeling quite magnanimous, so she offered to take her friend out to dinner, and so forth. Okay, so you can see here again, as I was saying at the beginning, you can see how these, in this case, you can see how you're seeing a relationship between the ideas in the. We have 2 independent clauses here, but we're seeing in the first one, when we use comma and but, we're showing a contrast between the first sentence or the first clause and the second clause. In the second one, you can see when you use so, you can see kind of a result. And so the second clause is kind of a result of the first. Okay. Now we can also use commas after introductory words, phrases, or clauses. And you can see here some include, things like however, well, or no. Comma, you might have an individual word. Sometimes when you're referring directly to somebody, like Jamie, could you pass me the salt? We put a comma after that. Okay. Sometimes you could have a complete phrase here. Their bodies twisted in frantic motion, comma, the athletes bounded across the finish line. It's a great little sentence there, isn't it? Pushed and prodded by the bustling crowd, comma, Nancy finally made it to her destination. Having defended his opinion, comma, the flustered student stormed out of the classroom. Now, lastly, we can have an introductory clause, and this is a clause that begins with what we call it a dependent clause is another word for it. This is one that begins with what we call subordinating conjunctions, which I'm not going to worry too much about that, but it's these words that sort of like since or while or because or when. And when we put it at the beginning of a clause, it sort of asks for more information. So you can see that first example there, since it was raining outside. Well, that's a clause. It was raining. We have a subject, we have a verb. But you put the since in front of it, and then now we're saying, well, what happened? There's got to be some result. And in this case, it's Ben grabbed his umbrella. So we put a comma after that. Now we don't. These clauses could be reversed, and in that case, you don't actually need a comma before it. So it's really only if you have that dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence. Okay. Yeah. All right. Keep going. Okay, so we've talked about lists. We've talked about linking. We talked about introducing, and now last we have here inserting. And this is kind of the most complicated to explain. But one of the ways I like to think of it, this is material that's not necessary for the meaning of the sentence, but it's sort of like extra information. I like to think of it as almost like an aside, like you're kind of like, oh, if you're talking, it's like you sort of pause a little bit to show that we're sort of just giving the extra information. So you can see here, September, which just so happens to be my birthday month, is the most beautiful month of them all. It is, in fact, my birthday month, so that is true. And what's going on here? Well, you can see here that it doesn't, the fact that it's my birthday month has really no bearing on the rest of the sentence. It's just extra information. So I'm assuming that the speaker considers September beautiful, not because of the birthday, although I suppose that's possible. Right? And in this case, we put a comma in front of that clause and at the end of that clause. Okay. Sometimes you could have a clause for. I'm trying to think of an example using that example. If you could say, if I wrote that sentence a little bit different, for example, if I said, what if there was a particular September that I thought was beautiful, and so you could say something like, the September, the December that I got married in was the most beautiful September I can remember. Okay, now that sentence, now I have that phrase there, that I got married in. Okay, now what happens is now that's actually important information or essential information because it's designating a particular September. In that case, you wouldn't put the comma. So that's when we talk about non-essential information or non-essential elements. We're talking about things that could be taken off, but sometimes that phrase or clause might modify in an important way what comes before it. So there we go. So we put a comma. That's one of the cases where we put a comma in front of the clause, or it's phrase or clause or word or after. Okay. Yeah, and we never use a single clause. We never use a single verb between the subject and the verb. So, for example, bowling shoes, comma, are required. Here we have a subject, bowling shoes, and then the verb are required. We don't want to do that. Yeah, we want to use. These are just a couple of. Yeah, sometimes, and this is just a little thing to remind yourself of. Sometimes students learn that rule of linking, where we have two independent clauses combined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, and then people, you might think, oh, well, if I see a coordinating conjunction, I should put a comma in front of it, and that's not necessarily the case, because coordinating conjunctions do a lot of work besides linking clauses. Sometimes they're just linking. Sometimes they're linking nouns or verbs. Like in this case, we picked up the snacks and headed over to. This is really that and is really coordinating the verb there, picked and headed, not clauses. Okay. Oh. And also, likewise with. This is something we see. If I would say one of the things we see, if there was a grammatical issue we see most commonly in the writing center, you might say it's this issue of the comma slice, and all it means is that if we have independent clauses, it's just been going over that when we link, we're combining two independent clauses with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, but you do have to have that coordinating conjunction. If you don't, then we call that a comma splice. Okay. Certainly, I think that one of the things I would say is that semicolons and colons are, less widely used. I think students, especially at the high school and even at the undergraduate level, are probably less likely to have used semicolons and colons readily. And in fact, the writer Kurt Vonnegut once said the only thing that a semicolon shows is that you've gone to college. So, meaning that it's kind of people, punctuation mark that educated people use. It has its uses, and I think it's worth kind of noting. And the same thing with the colon. It's kind of they're nice tools to have in your toolbox as a writer to be able to connect with your reader and express ideas. So, so a semicolon, what is it? A punctuation mark that's used chiefly in a coordinating function between major sentence elements. And then whereas a colon is used usually to direct attention to matter that follows. And we'll kind of see what that means when we look at the example. But they're actually, they look very similar. Sometimes I think they're close together, or they're actually on the same key. I forgot that on the keyboard. So it's, sometimes it's how sometimes you if you don't do shift, you might use the wrong one. Okay. All right. So semicolons. So you can see, first of all, what, just to go over, the semicolon looks like. You can see it here, in this example. Injustice is relatively easy to bear. What stings is justice. You can see the semicolon is it looks like a comma with a period above it. And one of the things I would say there is it's kind of a way to think about a semicolon is it's sort of like in between a comma and a period. So it's strong, because all of these are really, punctuation marks are really pauses in your writing. The comma seems to be like a short pause, whereas a semicolon is like a little bit of a longer pause. And it's one of the challenges, I'll just editorialize for a moment here. It's one of the challenges that we find with using punctuation effectively is that it's hard. These meanings are very subtle. And in spoken English, of course, we pause. But what's the difference between, a longer pause, a shorter pause, that in writing we have specific indications, period, semicolon, colon, comma, exclamation mark, question mark. But in writing, we use all of these different ones and they have slightly different meanings. And so sometimes it's harder to translate one to another. You have to get used to that, okay? So one of the basic ones is to combine two independent clauses. And it's basically, functionally, it's the same, it's coordinating clauses. So it functions the same way as that comma and coordinating conjunction does, like comma and, comma but, comma or. You certainly can use this, but you don't, in this case, you don't need, the difference here is that you don't need to spell out the relationship. You make the relationship is implicit when you use it, but nonetheless, you're saying, these are connected. Okay, so when you think they're related and you want to show that you think they're related, you can use the semicolon. Again, that's subtle, but it's something, it's a tool that a writer might want to use. The other thing that you could do is you could use a semicolon and then you could use one of those adverbs, we call them conjunctive adverbs, like, however, certainly, also, therefore. And the general rule is if that conjunctive adverb is more than a syllable long, you put a comma after it. Those could be moved. So you can see this example. He swallowed a lot of wisdom. However, it seemed as if it had all gone down the wrong way. You could move that, however, if you wanted to. So you could say, he swallowed a lot of wisdom. It seemed, comma, however, comma, as if it had all gone the wrong way, or or as you can see, there's actually several different places you could put that. The one would be to put it at the beginning. Okay. That is the main use of the semicolon, but there is a second use which is less used, but it's actually a really helpful tool. What if you have items in a list, but those items contain internal punctuation, a comma. So you look at this list here. Those who attended the church leadership council meeting included Ray, the district bishop, Joyce, Ray's wife, Marlon, the lead pastor, and Dwayne, the associate pastor. Well, you look at that list and you might say, how many people were actually at that meeting? I wouldn't be surprised if somebody said, well, there are 8 people there. Because you have Ray, you have the district bishop, you have Joyce, you have Ray's wife, you have Marlon, you have Lee. Okay, but if you look at it more carefully, you realize that's not what's going on. In fact, Ray is the district bishop, Joyce is Ray's wife, and so on. But because we're using commas like we would with individual items on a list, it gets confusing. So in this case, what we can do is we can use commas to separate for the internal punctuation, to separate, in this case, what's happening is we're giving a proper noun plus a descriptor of who that person is. So you can use the comma after, internally, and then you use the semicolon between the items in the list. And then you see here, oh, okay, it's really just 4 people. So again, this is, as I was saying at the beginning, one of the things we're looking for with punctuation is just to help make things clearer for the reader, to be more expressive, and to help out. So this is one of the areas where semicolons can help out with that, where we might get some confusion. Okay. So again, those 2 uses of the semicolon we saw, they can be used to link independent clauses, much like we could use a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or we could use them when we have items in a series with internal punctuation. So that's really the only 2 uses of the semicolon that I know of. Okay. Bunch of ways not to use it. I'm not going to go through that, but because again, these are things. Again, as I said, there's lots of ways not to use a semicolon, but if you follow the ways we talked about, you'll be okay. Okay, now colons. The last thing we're going to talk about here is colons, and this is a really helpful punctuation mark, and has a few uses. And I'm going to go through the first one, and then I'll mention something here as a kind of a general rule. You can see it. This is what I need from the grocery store: ham, milk, butter, grapes, and peaches. Okay, so this is a really standard use of the colon, is to introduce a list. In this case, the list is the grocery list: ham, milk, butter, grapes, and peaches. Okay, separated by commas there, right, because it's a list. But the key thing here is preceded by a complete thought, and this is true for all of the uses of the colon. Is that we want, if you imagine the sentence divided now up into left and right, the left side, or the introductory element, always should be a complete thought or an independent clause. So I should be able to put a period at where the colon is, and I could say, okay, that makes sense. And you can see that's going to be true for the other examples too. So when we have a quotation, sometimes we can, rather than just introducing a quotation with, Paul said, which we follow by a comma is the general rule. If we use a complete statement, which is usually kind of a paraphrase of the quotation, then we'll use a colon. The words of Paul provide us with encouragement. Okay, now I could put a period there, but I'm not because I'm introducing a quotation. So I put a colon. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Okay, and then last 2 uses are kind of the same thing, where we have the second part of the sentence is kind of explaining or renaming the first part. So you can see here, a healthy marriage, it has 2 important characteristics: love and respect. Now, what's happening? Well, in this case, that what follows the colon is, well, you can see in the slide here, it uses that word a positive, and an a positive is like a restatement of a noun, of a preceding noun. So in this case, the a positive is love and respect, and it's restating 2 important characteristics. So at the end of the sentence, you say, well, what are so you say, what are those 2 important characteristics? Well, they're love and respect. So it's an a positive is restating the same thing. A lot of times a positives are kind of like if you have a noun, like if you said like Dr. Nordlof, my English instructor. Okay, in that case, the a positive, if I was your English instructor, then that would be an a positive. You would say it's restating who I am. Okay, and then this last example here, sometimes the first clause is explained by the sentence. And so music is like medicine, it is good for the heart. Okay, so it's explaining the idea that comes in the first. So again, it's a relationship. You know, and you can see there again, as I said, semicolons and colons sometimes are pretty similar. This is an example where you can see that. Those are two independent clauses, but you'll notice the relationship is one, is a specific relationship where the second part of the sentence explains the first. Okay. Okay. So you can see here, just so you're not, you see teamwork is essential in, so if you have a preposition, you know, a prepositional phrase, you don't want to, or we have here, what I was saying, when I was saying here about a complete statement, you can see here, I enjoy many outdoor activities such as biking, hiking, swimming, and kayaking. You notice here, if I was to put my finger on the last part of the sentence, you say, I enjoy many outdoors activities such as, I'm left to wonder, well, it's asking for more information. So it's not really a complete statement before the colon. And so the sentence is fine. You just don't need punctuation before biking and before that list here. Okay.